All right, welcome to Lecture 2 for Module 3 for EDD 939, continuing to look here at the elements of strategic leadership. And in our last lecture, we talked about values, and now in this lecture, I want to talk about culture. And organizational culture is one of those things that I really enjoy talking about, so I'm going to have to work hard to keep myself constrained and within my time limits, and not even just organizational culture, just culture as a whole. It's a fascinating topic to me. I took a few courses on leadership and culture and intercultural leadership and things like that, and then even had the chance to teach some of those courses at another university. So I really enjoy talking about culture, both national or ethnic kind of culture aspects, but then also organization, because culture it shapes who we are and what we do, and it's fun to me to think about, to pause and go, wow, how much of what I do is because of my culture. Sometimes that's great and it's something to celebrate. Sometimes it's just interesting. Yeah, that is so much, to contrast cultures. And then other times it's like, oh, maybe that's not such a good thing just to be doing, and even though, it's how I was raised, so it's just part of the culture, but maybe that's something I should consider changing. So it's great to think about. And so let's dive right into this. So you see the section titled there, culture, and then the first slide that I'm looking at obviously says, what is culture? And culture, a couple of definitions here from Merriam-Webster. Culture is the customary beliefs, social forms, I think you could say social norms too, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group. And, you think our organizations definitely fall into the social group category. Sometimes they will hit on racial and or religious as well. A church is a religious and social group. It may, some churches are also based more around racial identity as well. So nonprofits, the same way. And so it can touch on all of those. And then the other one is, and this is definitely more organizational, the set of shared attitudes, values, goals, and practices that characterizes an institution or organization. And so the culture is in essence, it's what we do, or from the symbol, how we get things done, how we do what we do. So again, the mission is what we do from a parameters, but the culture is how we do it. So when I say what we do in this context, I'm talking really more about how we do it. And not just how we do things, but how we interpret things. And I think that's a key part of culture that we can't forget. Our cultural lens determines to a large extent how we interpret things. And I'm going to give you a quick example from my life personally, and forgive the personal illustration. And this is more of an ethnic culture kind of thing. I was born and raised here in Nebraska. White, middle class, and middle of America, and pretty traditional family from the, mom, dad, one brother, right? And so very much from if you're thinking about Gert Hofstede's Cultural Dimensions, if you're familiar with that, an individualistic culture, right? I had one brother. My mom I have one brother. My mom has one sister. She has two sons. So, and we were probably closer with them. So, I mean, when their family looked very much like ours. My dad, he had the big family. He had two sisters. So it was my dad and his two sisters. And then, my one aunt and uncle, they had a son and a daughter. And then my other aunt, she had one son, and she and her husband, one son and two daughters. And so, again, not huge families, very, very middle America. Both my mom and dad raised in Missouri. This is just, so I'm just painting the picture. My wife and I start dating. My wife, her family roots are Idaho and Pennsylvania. And she went to high school in Pennsylvania, and that was her home during college. But she grew up in Colombia, South America. Her parents were missionaries to an Indian tribe down in the jungles. And her mom died when she was 5, and then her dad remarried to an Indian lady. And so she was very much raised within the Guahibo Indian culture. Thatched roof hut, dirt floors, slept in hammocks, and their culture is very collectivist. Meaning, everyone can come and go as they please. That's just how they operate. On top of that, so my wife, and so she comes from a large family. From her mom, there were 5, and then from her stepmom, 4 more. And so there's 9 altogether, and it's great because there's no halves in their family, by the way. They're brothers and sisters, and so it's great. But where I'm going, so then her one sister, Naomi, married a guy named John. John and Naomi was born and raised there in Colombia within the Indian culture. That's also heavily influenced by Spanish culture. Then Naomi married a guy named John. John is from Micronesia. Micronesia is an island chain down in the South Pacific. It's a territory of the United States. And Micronesia also is very collectivist. And so, I'm getting to know John, and what I find out from John is everyone on the islands is a cousin. And to the point where he introduced me one time to an actual cousin, as in like their mom, this young lady, and their 2 moms were sisters, right? So, and he introduced her as, this is my cousin. But everyone else is cousin. And where I'm going is, when they lived in Greenville at the time, now they live in Nebraska near us, and we love having them around. But they lived in Greenville, South Carolina. We moved to Greenville, South Carolina. And our first year there, for Thanksgiving, we asked John and Naomi if they wanted to come over to our house for Thanksgiving. And they said, sure. And John said, do you mind if I invite some of my cousins? No, that's fine. Next thing I know, on Thanksgiving Day, it was, if you've ever seen the Hobbit movie, it was kind of like that scene where all the doors kept showing up at Bilbo's house. Because, the doorbell kept ringing, and it was like there were more Micronesians and more Micronesians and more Micronesians, and pretty soon the house is just bursting with Micronesians, and they're all cousins. And it was great. We had a blast. But that took some adjustment on my part, because my interpretation of cousins, I can count them all on 1.5 hands. So, and they were, when I say cousins, in my mind, that's the sons and daughters of my aunts and uncles. That's not the way the island interprets it. So all that to say, culture heavily impacts the way we interpret and view life and activities, and organizational culture is no different. Every organization, and in the last lecture I talked about customer experience as a value. Every customer-facing organization probably has within their value statement that they value and want customers to have an excellent experience. But then culture, the organizational culture then will dictate what that means. And this is why it's important to understand culture, because a lot of times value statements can look similar. And so if I move from one organization to another, I can look at their values and go, oh yeah, those look pretty similar to what my other organization had. And I know how it was interpreted over here. But when I get into this organization, what I find out is customer experience means something different. It may not be bad or anything, but it's just different, right? Cousins, the way we talked about them was different. And so we have to understand that. So that's the idea of what culture is. So let's move on to, I told you I could talk a long time about this. I'm going to have to move quickly. And The next slide is the elements of culture. And I'm not going to go through each one of these and give a lot of explanation, but these are the kind of things that we look at when I'm trying to learn or determine what is the culture of an organization or the culture of a group, if you will. So I'm going to look at things, or what are their traditions? What do they, well, I'll get to celebrations at the end. What are their traditions? What are their rituals? Monday morning meetings, Monday morning stand-up meetings. That's a ritual. It could also, quote unquote, be a tradition, but that's a very important thing, and that's, you move to an organization and they always have a meeting at this time on Monday or Friday or whatever, to begin the week or end the week. And, you've never experienced that. And what you find out is those are very, that's like sacred time, right? So those are the kind of things, artifacts. And this will tell you a lot. What's on the walls? Is the mission displayed very prominently? What are the important things to them? The events, what kind of events do they have? And then those are all kind of more the obvious ones. So then these are the ones that I want to point out a little bit more, because this is where it may not be as obvious. But topics of conversation. What do people talk about around the organization? Especially people who are in more of a leadership position. Are they talking about results? Are they talking about, sales or things, if it's that kind of a thing? Or are they talking about care, quality of care? Are they talking about, is it all about, for a college, all about enrollment numbers? And don't get me wrong. Most colleges are driven by tuition, so enrollment is important. But that's all they talk about. Meaning, you never hear them talk about quality of program. You never hear them talk about assessing academics. All they talk about is enrollment. That's indicating something to you, right? Or maybe it's an organization and they talk about assessment a lot, all kinds of assessment. Well, they have a very assessment-driven culture. That's what I'm getting at. It's not good or bad or right or wrong. What are the topics of conversation? What are buzzwords or speaking points that you hear coming up a lot? One organization that I toured during my leadership days, or during my PhD in leadership days, and then actually interviewed one of their executives for my dissertation. When you were there, you heard woven into conversation, to buzzwords, to speaking points, servant leadership. That was something that they prided themselves on, and I believe for the most part demonstrated. But it was woven into the fabric of what they said. So that's what I mean by buzzwords or speaking points. And again, sometimes those things take on a negative connotation. I don't mean them negatively here, but you would infuse that. When I worked at State Farm, we did a leadership academy, and it basically was a revamp, a reset, a change in the organizational leadership approach for our zone. And we knew it was working when we heard the terminology from the workshops being woven into everyday leadership conversations. That's when we knew we were achieving success, and it was becoming part of the fabric, part of the culture. So that's the idea. And then celebrations. And what I mean by this is, what do they celebrate? Not do they have celebrations, but what do they celebrate? Do they truly celebrate people's birthdays and anniversaries and things like that? And this is maybe more of a team, a smaller unit, unless it's a smaller organization. If they do, I'm going to say they're very people focused and people oriented. Do they have big celebrations when they hit sales goals and things like that, right? Do they have big celebrations to start? What are they celebrating? Those are going to be indicators of what the culture is like. Again, none of these are in and of themselves good or bad. Please don't hear me saying that. I'm not saying celebrating sales is a bunch of greedy. That's all I'm saying. I'm saying they're telling you we're a sales oriented culture. This is who we are, and you understand that. And so that's just the kind of thing you want to look at. And then the next slide, I made this statement: culture is like an onion, and that's not original with me. Gert Hofstede, again, he talks about this in his work on ethnic cultures, just for want of a better way of putting it. But culture is like an onion. And what we mean by that is, there's all the skins of the onion. And if you slice the onion, you can, and hold up the half, you can see the different layers of the onion, right? And that's what culture is like. That you have the most external layer of culture are going to be things like the actions. So that's going to be your celebrations, maybe your traditions. It could be dress, right? How are people dressed? When you walk in, and it's walk in on a Monday and then walk in on a Friday, and you're going to get a feel for they're more business formal or business casual, whichever, on Monday, but then on Friday, everyone's in jeans and Hawaiian shirts. Okay, so they can relax some, but that's kind of the culture, right? Those are the kind of things, that's that most external layer. It's the one that's easy to walk in and look around. Any stranger off the street who's paying attention could walk into the organization and go, okay, that's part of the culture. And then from there, it goes deeper down to where you get into the values and beliefs. And that's going to be kind of at that core of the onion, if you will. And you got to be around for a while to figure that out. Because let's be honest, does the fact that we have a business casual dress code Monday through Thursday say a lot about our values? No, not really. It might say that we're trying to be a little more professional, or it could be saying that we've had this dress code forever and no one's really had the desire nor the gumption or whatever to go change it, right? So that may or may not be saying a lot about our culture. Plus, hopefully that's not like a deeply held belief. I mean, I'm not saying change your dress code. I'm just saying, that's that's not a big deal, right? So those are the kind of things. So that's what we mean by culture is like an onion. Next, I just want to talk about culture and values for a little bit. And I kind of already talked about this under values, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. But culture and values work very much together. Our culture should be shaped by our values. And that's, again, if you think about the onion, that's what Hofstede said. The values are near the middle, and they influence out. So hopefully those external practices are being influenced by our values, but they're not the real core of who we are. But our values should influence our culture. It should not be the other way around. Our culture should not shape our values. And we have to be very, very careful about that, because our tendency as humans, I believe, is to adapt culture and not our values. And that causes even cognitive dissonance within us as individuals, because what I'm doing is not in agreement with what I believe. And so we have to be careful about that. And culture kind of using it as a general term for actions and behaviors. So values should shape and influence, push out on culture, rather than the other way around. Now, what can happen is this. And again, just to use the illustration of dress, it may be that we're holding on to this cultural norm of dress, and what we say is, That's it's not important. It's not a hill to die on. It's not a battle to fight. And it really doesn't matter to our values. We can still be who we are and let people wear jeans, right? And again, just using it as a silly illustration, but it's interesting how important dress code is to some people. So that's what we're talking about. You need to keep moving here. The next slide, culture in action. So this is where we really see it coming into play. To a certain extent, culture, and I already said this, it's how we get things done. So when you walk into an organization and, you've been through the interview process and you've been offered the job, you've been hired at your first day on the job. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes as people are introducing you and walking you around, what they may say is, oh, there's so-and-so over there. Make sure you get to know her, or make sure you get to know him. They know how to get things done, or they'll make sure you get anything you want, right? So that's a statement about culture, because it's how we get things done. Because on paper, that may not be the person I talk to. But what everyone is saying is, no, trust me, that's the person to talk to. And so that's what we're talking about. So it asks questions such as this. Who are the influencers in the organization? Who are the ones that you want to know? And you're already in the organization. Who are the ones that you know? They're the ones that you talk to because they're going to have someone's ear. Who are the decision makers? And it's not always who you think. Who are the power holders? And then, all of those kind of go together. I'll give you another illustration of this that I heard from someone. When I was in my PhD program, I had the privilege of being in class with an older gentleman. He was already retired, and he was pursuing his PhD. And, we all asked him, we said, what? No offense, but why are you here? And he said, it was life's goal to get my doctorate, and I like what I'm studying. I'm a student, and I really enjoy learning, and so, I'm not killing myself, but I've got the time and the money now to do it, and I'm going to do it. It was great. But he was a former city manager. And so he'd moved around. He and his wife had moved around a lot, and he'd been a city manager a lot of different places. So as we were talking about leadership and management, he was one of those guys you love being in class with, because he was just kind of this fount of life wisdom and knowledge, right? You could just learn so much, and just when he would start talking, I just kind of was like a sponge. I'm like soaking up what he had learned. Well, he was telling us about one time, and we were talking about culture and decision makers and stuff. He was he was a city manager up in Alaska. And long story short, they had to come to an agreement with a local First Nation tribe. And so they set up this meeting, and they gathered there, and you had the tribal leaders who were all men. And so he was there with, his team, and they were talking, but it was in a community center, and all, they'd invited, the whole tribe, town, village was welcome to come. And so, a lot of people there, but they were having this conversation with the leaders, who again were all men. And as they were engaging in the conversation and negotiating things, he noticed that the one man kept looking kind of off to the side, and there was an older lady there. And he'd look over at her, and it took this gentleman a while to notice, but he did, and she would nod or shake her head, and then he would move forward or change things. Long story short, what this man that I was in class with, I think his name was Ed, we'll call him Ed. What Ed finally realized was she was the true decision maker, power holder, because they actually, even though on the surface they had these men as tribal leaders, this tribe was a very matriarchal society, and there usually was one grandmother type who basically was kind of the power holder for the tribe. And she operated through her proxies of the tribal leaders. And so if she was on board with what you wanted to do, life was good. And so this man, even though he was the leader, was looking to her for approval. And so, I think if I remember correctly, they took a break. So Ed started talking to the people, found that out. And so it was kind of, then he was able to do more research as far as, okay, what is she looking for? And, and they were able, as I recall, come to a good decision. But that's an example of where culturally she was the one, and you need to know that, because again, the surface of the onion in that case, it was these men, these tribal leaders, but in reality, it was this one woman who really held all of the power. They were not going to do anything that she didn't approve of. And so those are the kind of things that we look at. That's culture in action, and that's often true in organizations. I've seen that. I've been in one organization I was a part of. We would be in meetings, and I would watch the chief executive that we were in the meetings with, and when a decision needed to be made, there was an older gentleman there who was kind of in a consulting role, but this man would lean over and here's what I think we need to do. Pretty soon you realize he was the real power holder, this consulting individual. And so sometimes in the tribal situation that's fine. In this situation, I'd argue maybe that wasn't the best situation to have, because there was no accountability for him, right? For this consultant. Anyway, you get the idea. So quickly, culture and strategy. Culture and strategy. Peter Drucker made the statement, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I think what he was going at there, and another guy, I think from GE or Ford maybe, popularized that statement in a book that he wrote, but Drucker is the one that said it. And I think the idea is that second bullet, as you're developing strategy, you have to be very aware of the culture and how it will enhance or potentially impede. Because you may have the best strategy in the world, but if your culture doesn't support it, the culture's going to win. That's what Drucker was driving at. So, and if you have a horrible culture within your organization, your strategy may be great, but you're still going to die. So don't and that's part of what Drucker was driving at too, because when he was writing, there was this craze for strategy and strategic thinking, strategic planning, and having all of these plans, again, that kind of gave some of the bad taste in people's mouths because we make binders and put them on the shelves. And Drucker was driving home the point, and he was the one that talked about strategy, but he was driving home the point. Hey, don't forget about your culture. Your culture is vital. And we need to understand in all of this that culture change is a very long and laborious process. And a lot of times when we're engaging in strategic work, it may result in a cultural change of some kind. That's a long-term project. You do not change your organizational culture overnight. And so you have to be in it for the long haul. That's just kind of an awareness about that. All right, so that'll conclude this lecture. Again, went a little bit long on this one. The final lecture that I do on climate, I think, will be a little bit shorter. Between the two, I've put the next lecture, lecture 3, is another TED Talk I'd like you to watch by Dan Ariely. I'm probably butchering his last name. But he's talking about motivation and things like that, but he gets into talking about culture within an organization. And again, how do we motivate people and things like that? So it's not a direct apples to apples kind of talk regarding culture, but I think it's a good one. And I don't agree with everything he says, but I like a lot of what he says about what do we reward, and that's part of culture. And that's what I want you to get out of that, thinking through, here's what we say, but here's how we act, and making sure those are congruous with one another. So hopefully you enjoy that, and then I'll see you back here to talk about organizational climate.